Apparently, Netflix wants to make games now, and they seem so serious about it all of a sudden, releasing both a freaking League of Legends game on mobile, how cool is that, we'll get back to that later by the way, and then also recently acquiring Next Games, the developers of that really popular The Walking Dead game. So, here's the plan. I've got a tier list over there, I've got a bunch of brand new Netflix games over here that I'm gonna play every single one of to give you a quick breakdown of what I like and dislike about each of them, and then we'll see how they hold up against the over 700 games I've already covered here on YouTube. Now, this is my cup of tea. I actually think this roguelike RPG and maybe the League of Legends game we played before are some of the best within their genres on mobile, so I'm impressed, Netflix. Didn't expect that. The first game today is one of those that also intrigued me the most, the Slay the Spire style roguelike deck builder called Arcanium Rise of Akhan. The short and sweet of this game is that we battle our way through a map made up of hexagon tiles, each of which can hold enemies to fight, a shop, a random event, and so on. Before we start a game though, we pick 3 out of a total of 14 heroes, each of which has a unique starting deck and mana pool, and during the turn-based combat, we then draw and play cards for each of these heroes. And as we progress through the game, we then unlock everything from new cards we can add to our decks, to stat boosting blessings, and much more like that. Lane switching and taunting enemies are also things in this game, and I could just go on and on here because the strategic elements run really deep in Arcanium, which I'm really loving. I know that some say it's difficult to select cards from our hand due to the UI here in the mobile version of the game, but this honestly didn't bother me when I played the game, so I'm not gonna let that drag it down in my personal ranking of it, so I think it deserves a spot here in the S tier category as one of the best Slay the Spire alternatives on mobile. Another game that just immediately caught my eyes as I started looking into these Netflix games was this one called Hextech Mayhem, which is a fast-paced, rhythm-based, side-scrolling runner that takes place, and hold on now, in the League of Legends universe. So the objective in this game is to tap either the jump, downward dash, or bomb throwing buttons exactly when our character reaches one of the icons that represent these reactions. Think of it basically like a music rhythm game, but instead of notes falling from the top of the screen, our character automatically runs to the side of the screen while we then tap to the beat of the music to avoid obstacles and defeat enemies. It has awesome explosions, great humor and fun voiceovers, lots of colorful special effects, and just overall more polished than most games on mobile, honestly, and I'm just loving it. The only downside is that the buttons are placed far away from each other and we can't fully customize the size and location of these buttons. But the game still just really threw me back to the simpler mobile gaming days when games just had a fun core gameplay loop and not all the other fluff around that. So I really enjoyed that, and I think it deserves an A tier spot. We're gonna get to no less than 2 Stranger Things games in a bit, by the way, but first I wanted to try one of the casual games called Teeter. And this is a very simple arcade game where we balance a small ball on a stick, and our objective is to get it to a hole placed somewhere on the screen by tapping either side to make that side of the stick move upwards. And that's about it for this game, and then we just have to try to get through all 150 levels. And yes, there are some dangers introduced later on to make it a bit more tricky, but the levels still won't take long to complete, and it's just such a simple game that I can't really give it more than a C tier position. Now there's a good chance you've already played this next one called Stranger Things 1984, because this adventure RPG where we start out playing as the officer Jim Hopper is also the oldest of all of these Netflix games. The core gameplay here basically has us run around town to visit various buildings full of puzzles while we search for all the lost children we know from the TV show. And unlike most mobile games based on TV franchises, this is actually a great retro style experience with neat pixel art, lots of great animations, good humor, and an interesting world full of items to interact with. Where it gets really interesting though is when we start finding some of the children and can then switch around so we play as them instead, which allows us to get into places that we couldn't reach when playing as Hopper. If you haven't played it yet, this is overall such an easy recommendation because it's a great retro game, and I'm gonna land it right here in the A tier category. Next up is a game called Dominoes Café, which is a digital version of the game of Dominoes. So that means it's a 2-player game where we keep taking turns placing domino bricks from our hand until one player has no more dominoes left, or we can't place any more pieces on the playing field, and we then earn points depending on how many dots are left on the bricks the opposing player still hasn't gotten rid of. This mobile version of the game is fast-paced, and it actually has lots of really nice quality of life features, like the fact that we can just tap a brick and it will automatically be placed at the correct place on the board. But the game also tries to trick us into believing that we're playing actual other players, which we're definitely not, by the way, because matchmaking takes less than a second, and I really didn't like that, so I think I'm gonna place it here in the C tier category. Knittens is... well, its cat animations is straight up nightmare fuel, but the gameplay is a cute match-free game where each level has unique win condition, like removing a certain number of purple yarns from the map within a limited number of moves. But what I didn't see coming though is that there are actually quite a few puzzle elements and different types of mechanics introduced along the way, making this a fairly good alternative to something like Candy Crush, and of course without all the ads and in-app purchases. So even though I thought I was gonna really dislike this one, I'll be honest with you guys, I might just have to reward it with an A tier position because there are just so few games like this games out there on mobile that aren't filled absolutely to the brim with advertisements. So A tier for this one, even though I'm not really gonna play it myself that much. The next game is an incremental strategy idle game called Dwarves, where we play as 4 dwarves slowly digging through infinite connected dungeons full of treasure and enemies. The way it works is that our dwarves attack whatever is in front of their lane automatically, while we then manually trigger their special abilities, equip whatever loot they find, and spend gold to upgrade them. And as an idle game, all of this of course continues even if we close the game, but it doesn't have any other systems that add any form of strategy to the gameplay. So while I love the theme of this game, it has no longevity, and I'll have to place it here in the E tier category. But let's get back to the actual good games, because this next one, called Card Blast, is easily one of the most unique games we're gonna talk about today. It's essentially a simple but fun card game where the goal is to make poker hands like pairs, 3 of a kind, flush, full house, and so on by dragging cards from our hand to multiple containers on the playing field. But the thing that makes it tricky though is that cards are automatically and continuously drawn from our deck, and so if we're not fast enough at removing these cards from our hands, they will eventually reach a huge saw placed on the left side, and we then lose the game. And I love a system like this because it forces us to think fast, and it really pushes the gameplay forward. And then we basically just go through a bunch of levels, winning each of them by reaching a minimum score requirement. The biggest downside here is that it can feel a bit luck-based, but I still really enjoyed this more than I thought I would, so I'm gonna place it over here among the other A tier games. Now, hear me out. I love minigolf, so when I saw Wonderputt, which is a casual minigolf game, I thought this was gonna be amazing, and this game could have been great, but the camera doesn't always move around correctly, so we can't see the entire map, which makes it almost impossible to figure out where to aim in this game. And it's just a shame really, because the art style is great and the universe is definitely unique and interesting, but the gameplay just doesn't hold up, so I can't give this more than a D tier status. Asphalt Xtreme is an awesome single and multiplayer rally racing game that Gameloft actually discontinued last year, only for it to return as one of these Netflix games. For this game, I actually already did a full review here on YouTube, but it basically has us race through a ton of levels in game modes, including a career and real-time online multiplayer, while then gradually unlocking and leveling up 38 vehicles ranging from freaking monster trucks to boogies and pickups. But instead of traditional linear racing tracks though, each level features multiple paths, including lots of jumps and ramps and opportunities to crash the opponents, which in my opinion is what makes the gameplay both fun and hectic. The biggest downside is that the progression is relatively slow, but the fast-paced gameplay and almost endless amount of content easily compensates for that, so I think I'm gonna place it here in the A tier category. Krispee Street is a Where's Waldo type relaxing puzzle game where we're shown a huge 2D hand-drawn map full of characters, buildings, vehicles, and animals, and we then have to find the locations of a bunch of specific items to complete the level. Now, after having played this game for a while, I gotta admit that it's actually surprisingly well made, with lots of attention to detail, like how the music and sound effects change depending on where you look on the map, and it's also just really difficult with a good amount of levels to pick from. So all in all, this is an easy A tier game. Next up is kind of a unique one. It's another game by the same developer, by the way, called Bowling Ballers, which is a bowling game mixed with a forward runner like Subway Surfers. So that means we hold down our finger on the screen to make our bowling ball race down this seemingly endless track, while we then try to collect gold, hit bowling pins, and avoid obstacles by swiping to either side to move our ball. Now, unlike Subway Surfers though, this is actually not an endless game, as there are a bunch of levels for us to complete, although there is also an endless mode and a few other game modes that we can dive into once we've completed those levels. Overall, it's a pretty great take on creating a casual bowling game, and so although it didn't catch me quite enough to make me just instantly hooked, I think it does deserve a B tier spot. And now for the newer Stranger Things game called Stranger Things 3, which is made by the same developers as that previous Stranger Things 1984 game. This time though, it takes place in a much more open world, and we've got this nice isometric perspective, and in fact, in many ways, it takes what worked well in the first game, and it just greatly expands it. So that means we're still running around solving puzzles and switching between characters to use each of their unique abilities, and there are also still a lot of baddies to beat up in the game. It's honestly just a great retro adventure RPG, so I think this could land anywhere between S and A tier, but I am ultimately gonna reward it with the S tier badge because of things like the controller support. And just hold on now for a sec here, there is a game where we control a Nerf gun attached to a basketball that constantly rotates a bit. And yes, you guessed it, when we tap the screen, the Nerf gun fires, blasting the basketball in the opposite direction. What else do you even need to know about this one? The goal of the game is to get the basketball into the hoop, which we have 14 Nerf gun shots to accomplish, and if we succeed, we then move on to the next level and get 14 new shots, but if we fail, we have to start all over again. I gotta give it to this game, it is admittedly hilariously difficult to properly calculate the velocity and the rotation speed so we can perfectly time our shots, but it is still such a simple experience that I can't really rank it higher than C tier. Now, all of these games do require a Netflix subscription to be played, and while I wouldn't pay that subscription just to play these games alone, it is a pretty neat bunch of games to have access to for free, without ads, without in-app purchases, if you already use Netflix. Most of these games were also a lot better than I actually thought they were gonna be, so now I'm kinda excited to see what sort of games they plan to have next games released for the platform. But maybe you agree or disagree with my views on these games. Let's discuss that in the comment section down below. Thank you very much for watching till the end. Thanks for supporting on Patreon. Thank you so much for using Mini Review to discover awesome new mobile games. And until next time, just keep gaming, stay awesome, and I'll see you guys around.